On this episode of Most Notorious, a medieval murder mystery, who murdered Sir William Cantilupe?
They went down to the stables and got a sack for the body, drew water from the well, brought it into the kitchen, boiled the water in the kitchen, brought the water back up to the bedchamber, washed the body in the water so that to stop the wounds, so that when they put the body in the sack, the wounds wouldn't bleed and give them away.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Most Notorious podcast. I'm Eric Rivenes. Thank you for joining me. So before I get started, a quick update about something I had mentioned I'd been thinking about doing. This was a few months ago. I can't remember exactly which episode I said this in, but I'd been kicking around the idea of replacing or redoing the first dozen or so Most Notorious episodes. Well, I got a lot of responses from you, and the vast majority of them, the message was, leave them the way they are. They are part of the history of the show. Well, this is a show about history, I guess. I don't want to be accused of being revisionist, so I will let them be. So thank you to everyone who shared their feelings about this idea with me. And things are staying put for the time being. Well, let's get on with the show. I'm very pleased to have as my guest today Melissa Julian-Jones. She is a history teacher at Cardiff University, a historian who specializes in medieval networks, family power, and strategy in the 13th century. And her book, which of course she is here to discuss, is called Murder During the 100-Year War: The Curious Case of Sir William Cantilupe. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Sure. So what is it that interests you about this time period?
Yes, I've always been fascinated in the 13th century, or the part that we call the High Middle Ages in when you're talking about Wales and England, mainly because I grew up in Wales and there are so many castles here locally. Most of them are from most of the stone castles date from the 12th and 13th century, and those are the ones that you can go around. And we've got Caerphilly Castle really close by, and that's one of the best examples of a concentric castle in Europe. So we're really lucky just to have that on our doorsteps. And I've just grown up fascinated by particularly Welsh history, and the Cantilupes that I wrote about for my thesis were a family of Norman or Anglo-Norman lords who moved into Wales fairly late in their careers, and they gained lands in the March through marriage, and they are part of the sort of tapestry of colonisation and colonialisation of Wales by Anglo-Normans and the English. So it's just a very interesting time period to me. And as I was researching that family a little bit for my sort of PhD, which I fell into. I was thinking about doing a number of topics in my PhD, and I really love doing sort of looking at social networks, and just it was just interesting to me to see how the family strategy evolved for knightly families, and I did a comparison basically as my thesis between a family that was new to Wales and a family that had been established on the Welsh border for some time. And I was looking to see what their similarities were and what their differences were. And one of the families was the Cantilupes, and I noticed that they were just a very colourful group of people to in their own right. And so the book, Murder During the 100 Years' War, which is set sort of 1375 or focused on 1375, is a little bit out of my comfort zone, being the 14th century, but it was just such an interesting murder. So yeah, once you get into it, it's just a really interesting thing. And obviously, it's set much more in England, being in Lincolnshire. So that again is a little bit out of my comfort zone, because I focus mainly on the Welsh borders and Wales. But it's just fascinating to see how the family, even though at that point they didn't have any lands in Wales anymore, still kind of benefited from social networks that their sort of ancestors had cultivated. So yeah, I've just always been interested in medieval history, but there's just so much to be fascinated by.
Absolutely, yeah. So the Hundred Years' War is in the title of your book. So maybe we can talk about that first. Maybe if you wouldn't mind summarizing the war. Where in the war does this story take place, and how is this story connected to the war?
Yeah, so it's the Hundred Years' War was not an ongoing conflict. It was a series of conflicts with a number of truces. There were lots of different campaigns. It began in 1337, and it was to do with dispute between the French royal house of Valois and the English royal house of Plantagenet about the succession of the French throne. So you have a number of battles and a number of campaigns where the English go into France. So you have people who are veterans of certain campaigns coming back for later campaigns. It's also where a lot of the knightly class sort of cut their teeth in their first campaigns, sort of the first military action that they get, when England is not at war with Scotland as well. So you have the Earl of the March, for example, led his first campaign in France when he was 17. And that's the one that William Cantilupe, who is the subject of the book and was murdered in 1375, that's the campaign that he was present on. So the Hundred Years' War is a constant backdrop, and for the knightly class at the time, that's kind of the main source of action that they got. You also had campaigns in Scotland and a couple in Ireland as well, I think. But you have, and also the Iberian Peninsula, but you've got the main bulk of the action for William Cantilupe would have been in France. And so a lot of the major kind of events that shaped his life happened around the time of that campaign. And then he disappears from the records after being brought home from that campaign. And he was actually arrested for the murder of his brother, and brought back to the Tower of London, and that ended his career as his sort of his military career. He then disappears from the records for about 4 or 5 years until he's found dead in a ditch. So that's the context to this, really, and that's kind of where the title comes from.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, you do go into, in some detail, his relationship with his brother, Nicholas.
Oh yeah.
Could you tell us more about this? Why would he have been accused of murdering his brother?
Well, so this is a very complicated chapter in Cantaloupe history. So you have the two brothers. Nicholas is the older brother. There's only a few years between them. They're not. There's not a big age gap. There's only like 3 or 4 years between them. So their grandfather was called. So all of the Cantalupes are called Nicholas or William, right? Just assume that if we're talking about a Cantaloupe in these few generations, they're either called Nicholas or William. So grandfather Nicholas was a diplomat, a spy, had a very successful military career. He just was one of those disguised as a monk, I think, who broke into a castle in Scotland. There's all these stories about him, and he was the one who kind of restored Cantaloupe family fortunes, if you like, after the failure of the male line for the main branch of the family, which resulted in all of the Cantaloupe lands that weren't held by the cadet branches being handed off among other families that had married into the Cantilupes. So grandfather Nicholas was kind of set on making the Cantilupe reputation again. He was close with the king, and he had a big reputation sort of among his fellow elite. And it was decided for some reason, and I'm not reading too much into this because other families do it as well, to skip his son, William, and hand over directly the title and the bulk of the lands to his grandsons, Nicholas and William. I told you they're all called Nicholas and William, so hopefully you're following this. So Father William, Nicholas's son, had a good whack of inheritance. He wasn't kind of shortchanged. He'd made a good marriage, and he and his wife and his stepmother, which was grandfather Nicholas's second wife, had the lands in trust, if you like, while the little boys grew up. And they were the ones that kind of administered that until the children came of age. So we get to our William, who who was, I think, 11 when his granddad died, and he inherited, it was set to inherit his share when he came of age. And Nicholas, his brother, who William's accused of murdering, was about 13, 14. So we don't know very much about their childhood. We do know that they would have been prepared to take over their lands and estates. We do know that knightly children were trained in different arts of war, hunting, various things like that from a very young age. And also marriage was a big thing. So so local heiresses were suggested, and for Nicholas, who was going to inherit the title, he was betrothed to Catherine Paynell, whose father was a very important man in the locality. And that seems to have been all right for all of them. Catherine was a few years younger than Nicholas, so they had to wait until Catherine came of age before they could actually get married legally, properly, and she had to consent to it. That all seemed to go all right, but just before the wedding, Catherine apparently was speaking to one of Nicholas's kinswomen, who said, "My lady, I'll give you a penny if you ever have joy of your husband." And Catherine didn't know what this meant until the wedding night, when Nicholas was really not interested in her at all. And Catherine didn't know why this was and was very upset. So this is where it gets both murky and disturbing. So Nicholas had made it very clear he wasn't interested in sex, and Catherine waited until he was asleep and then put her hand between his legs to see if she could arouse him. And that's when she claims that she felt nothing at all there. So she's not saying that she felt what she would describe perhaps as female genitalia. She's saying that she didn't really know what she was feeling, if you like. So there was an inquest to determine if the marriage could be annulled, and this is part of her testimony. So it's very difficult to tell retrospectively whether Catherine was, for example, telling the truth, or what she was describing, or if she didn't have vocabulary to describe things. And you're working within a medieval framework that doesn't allow for the vocabulary for, say, intersex people, or so it's a problematic series of texts to work with. But essentially, that's what her testimony was. She tried to get an annulment straight away, but was persuaded to stay with Nicholas for a couple of years to see if marital affection would grow between them. Apparently, it did not. And so she left Nicholas's house when the 2 years was up to go back to live with her parents. Nicholas did not want her to pursue an annulment. Point blank refused to have a physical examination. and sent a group of armed men to fetch her back. He then threatened her with incarceration and showed her the leg irons that he was going to use on her if she didn't basically say that her testimony was false and take it back. And she also he dragged her into the chapel in front of witnesses and made her swear on the Bible that they had had sex and that there was nothing different about him, and that he was capable of getting her with child. And so she swore those oaths to him under duress, and he brought this up in court that she'd sworn these oaths, and her one of her priests confessors said, well, that doesn't count because she was under duress when she swore them. So it took a very long time, but Nicholas and Catherine's marriage was annulled by the bishop in the Ecclesiastical Court of York. Nicholas then went to see the Pope in France, and he was going to contest this annulment. So he was sort of going to go over the Archbishop of York's head and go straight to the Pope. And while he was in France, he died, and the symptoms looked suspiciously like arsenic poisoning. So the only person who was in France at the same time was William, his younger brother, who stood to inherit everything since Nicholas didn't have any children or any heirs, and William was his next heir. And so William was arrested for Nicholas's murder. He was then taken back to London and kept in the Tower of London for a few months. It was then decided, for some reason, and we're not sure why, that it wasn't arsenic poisoning at all. Nicholas had in fact died of natural causes. And everything was dropped. William was let out, and he was sort of never. Well, he literally disappears from the records for 4 or 5 years until he turns up dead. So we don't really know what his relationship was like with his brother. While all this was going on, William had gone abroad to France on campaign. So this is one of the sort of slash and burn campaigns where the English army mainly engaged with the French peasantry, while the French Royal Army held back and didn't engage with them. And the English army basically lived off the land and burned a lot of crops and so did whatever they wanted for a few months. And then William was on the king's business there for a little while after that as well, at the time he was arrested. So we don't know what his relationship was like with Nicholas growing up. While Nicholas's marriage was imploding, he wasn't there at all. So it's an interesting one, and it's something that is a big gap in our knowledge about the family, and there's sort of no sources that we can look at. So you just have to kind of fill in that yourself and try not to jump to too many conclusions. But basically, that's the story of the two brothers.
Interesting. And you do theorize in your book about the physical issue Nicholas might have been dealing with, right?
Yeah, so it's difficult to. I mean, a lot of articles about Nicholas as and his annulment and that kind of thing do tend to pathologize his condition, and it's very, very difficult to retrospectively diagnose somebody who you can't talk to, or see, and especially at a time when the source material doesn't have the vocabulary to describe what's happening or what's going on with them, and also that person doesn't have the vocabulary that we would recognize in the 21st century, to kind of use about themselves, or to identify. So yeah, so it's really hard. It's likely, based on the research of Frederick Pedersen, that he possibly had a congenital adrenal hyperplasia is something that has been suggested. And one of the symptoms of that is that you lose a lot of salt in your body, apparently. And so you have to be careful about how much exercise you take and overexertion. And part of Pedersen's argument is that this is potentially why Nicholas didn't have a military career himself, and why he sent armed men out to get Catherine back. He didn't go himself. And it's also one of the reasons why he may have died in France, and that the manner of death suggests that as well, because it's gastrointestinal distress, and the various symptoms that look like arsenic poisoning. So that's an interesting theory, one of the most likely ones potentially, but again, it's very difficult to know for sure.
And as far as Nicholas's alleged sexual limitations, is there a guess about that? What was going on there?
That's part of so the fact that Nicholas had atypical genitalia is sort of obviously Catherine's own testimony. It's sort of suggested that he didn't have any testicles. That's what she said, and possibly a micropenis, basically. She said that it was as flat as the back of a man's hand, was what she described. So she's not describing female genitalia. But he also is very tall and very deep voiced. And that's apparently the testicles then ascend after puberty, I think, or something like that, with that particular condition. So yeah, so that's one of the reasons that Pedersen has suggested that particular theory. So it's difficult to say exactly, again, because Nicholas refused to have a physical examination. They were very intrusive, they were very embarrassing. It would be a matter of public record, and it's the kind of thing that if you're particularly proud, or you just or just a very private person, like it's really not having sort of wise women fondle you and then tell you off for not rising to the occasion is not something that anyone particularly wants to go through, I think. So,
Right.
but which was part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that something like this was documented during the medieval era and still theorized about today.
Yeah, it's part of if anyone's interested, it's part of the records of the Ecclesiastical Court of York. So it's kept in the archives, and most of these are digitized. So this particular case is digitized. It's in some of it's in not great condition, and it's not very easy to read. Obviously, it's in medieval Latin, and in that particular kind of handwriting, that scribal handwriting. So it is quite hard, but you can access it online, and you can sort of look it up yourself as well. But yeah, it's amazing what has survived. Really, there's a lot of detail.
Yeah. So basically, there is a lot of drama going on in the Cantilupe family, right?
Yeah, yeah, just a bit. Um, and we don't know what anyone else thought of this. So we don't really know what his father was doing at this time. We don't know, I mean, whether he had paternal or, sort of relational support. We don't know. One of his kinswomen, as I said, I think was a witness for Catherine while the situation was embarrassing and Catherine had sexually assaulted him, essentially. You've also got the fact that he had threatened her with incarceration and actual leg irons and shackles. And so you have a very, very messed up kind of situation there where it's a very toxic environment, if you like, for both of them. And it's just a very, very difficult situation to kind of start to unpick. So you don't really know what anyone is thinking. We know that the Paynells immediately married Catherine off again to John Onsell. And one of the first things they did as a newly married couple immediately after the annulment went through was to challenge William Cantilupe as soon as he was released from prison and received his inheritance, because he was not allowed to receive his inheritance until it was decided that he was not guilty of murder. That three castles that Catherine said belonged to her should have been given back to her, but they weren't. And it was found that the castles should be inherited by William because Catherine and John didn't have the right paperwork, if you like, to persuade the king or the king's representative in court that those castles actually did belong to Catherine. So that didn't go well. So the Paynells, the relationship that had been built up between the Paynells and the Cantilupes by their grandfather, that was all completely gone now. And Ralph Paynell is not the kind of person that you upset. So he'd been Sheriff of Yorkshire for a few terms and had to answer for his excesses. Sort of the corrupt sheriff stereotype, if you like, but generally means taking advantage of various people and getting a lot of money that you shouldn't have. But yeah, so it's a very complicated situation. And also, when William is released from prison and goes back to Lincolnshire, he enters a world where not only has his brother lost a lot of support, but there is now a lot of talk in the county about the family in general. And one of Catherine's, not witnesses, but so you're allowed to bring what's, I suppose, termed as common knowledge to court as evidence. And so the common knowledge of the county, which was established by the jury, was that Nicholas was impotent. And that means that everybody was discussing this prior to the annulment, prior to the court case. And so you have a situation where William comes back into this very kind of volatile, I guess, situation where the Cantilupes have lost a lot of face and lost a lot of reputation, but also lost a lot of allies. And he is married now. We don't know when he got married. He may have got married before he went abroad, in which case he hasn't seen his wife for several years. But she is Maude Neville, and the Nevilles and the Paynells are very good friends, and she's very good friends with Catherine Paynell, and she knows Ralph Paynell quite well as well. Who is kind of like a surrogate, who seems to have become a sort of surrogate father figure for her, which we can see through their interactions later on. So his wife is allied with his brother's enemy, essentially, and he's coming back not having really spent a lot of time with his wife and not having spent a lot of time in the county, and not having had much to do with the lands and estates there at all. And then, of course, 4 years later, he's killed. So,
right.
It's yeah,
Fascinating.
That's the situation.
Yeah. So his body was found in an isolated place in the late spring of 1375, right?
Yep, that's right. So early May, I think. So it's discovered by some villagers of the village of Graham. And they raise the hue and cry because they basically if you find a body in the field, that's what you do. They call the coroner. While they wait for the coroner, because the coroner's in Lincoln, they have to make sure that no people or animals disturb the body. You're supposed to leave it exactly where you found it, unless you're in London or, a very busy street and the body's just lying in the middle of the road, in which case you've got to sort of get it out the way. But
right.
there's usually a house that people would bring it into that's a designated house, and lay it out. But generally, you're supposed to leave it where it is. The coroner can have a look. And the coroner came and established the identity of the body. He'd been there about 3 months, 4 months maybe at that point. So you can imagine the state of it is not particularly great. And identity was most probably established through what he was wearing, but also if he did have any recognizable features that remained, that would be helpful. But also the fact that he hadn't been seen for 3 or 4 months. So chances were, they established it was William Cantilupe, and sort of went, oh right, so where was he last? And he was at his wife's manor of Scotton, Lincolnshire, but his wife was not there. And so he'd been, bearing in mind, he'd been missing literally for 3 or 4 months. And she had, for some reason, packed up and left the manor abruptly, dismissed all the servants, and she was now in Caythorpe, which is a good few miles away, and staying with Sir Ralph Paynell. And she had with her her maid Agatha and William's armour bearer Richard Guise. So the coroner went, this is suspicious.
Sure.
So the sheriff of Lincolnshire at the time was Thomas de Cydale, who was a widower with a 10-year-old son at the time. And he promptly arrested everybody, and I mean everybody. So he, he arrested Maude, Sir Ralph on suspicion of aiding and abetting, obviously, Agatha the maid, the armour bearer Richard Guise, and then about 13 other members of that household who had been dismissed, rounded them up as much as he could, including the steward, and summoned them all to court, and charged them with murder, because William had been stabbed multiple times in the torso, and you don't need you don't need really to forensic expert to know how he died. But yeah, so he was. So the coroner's report is that there were multiple diverse stab wounds to his chest area.
So there were some who believed he had been killed by highwaymen, right?
That's what it was supposed to look like, I think. Yeah, and that was discounted by the sheriff and the coroner fairly quickly, because they didn't at any point seem to go looking for any, highwaymen or rogues that may have been. And these aren't sort of 18th century highwaymen. These are just sort of gangs of people who would accost you. They may well be landowners. They may well be members of the knightly elite, or they might be monks, or they might be ne'er-do-wells from the local from the local village. It depends, really. But at no point did they take that seriously. The reason that it was suggested, or that it was meant to look like that, was because he was dressed in his riding clothes. So he had his spurs on, he had his belt on, he had his shirt on. But it was discounted fairly quickly, probably because it should have been obvious that the clothes he was dressed in was not what he'd been killed in, because he'd been dressed after he'd been stabbed. So there wouldn't have been blood on the shirt, there wouldn't have been the corresponding rips in the shirt. So that's a bit, I mean, how do you stab somebody without getting blood on their shirt? So, yeah.
So were they able to find evidence that linked this murder to anyone in particular?
Well, no. Well, this is the thing, because a lot of the servants didn't show up to their court dates and were declared outlaws. And then you have Maude, Lady Maude, who apparently gave testimony and explained what happened. So she apparently told the sheriff what had happened, and this was presented to the jury, and you only have her word for it. Can't be corroborated, because everybody pleaded not guilty that came to court. And you can't tell a story if you're claiming that nothing actually happened, right? So Maude's story is that the actual place where the murder occurred was their bedchamber in Scotton Manor. And William got ready for bed, and it was important that they knew, because obviously he didn't have the last rites. It was important that they knew sort of his last movements, and it was established that he died at peace with God and the king, which presumably meant that he was killed after he'd said his nightly prayers. He was in his nightshirt, and he had locked their chamber door for the night. It was one of the very few rooms of the manor that would have had a lock and a key, and the holders of the keys would have been the steward, the chambermaid, and the chamberlain. So the steward doesn't live in the manor. The steward had his own house and sort of administered the estates and things, and came in, but he didn't live there. So he wasn't present. So you're down to two. I mean, the steward probably wouldn't have had keys to the chamber anyway, but Agatha, the maid, apparently was the one who gave the key to Richard Guise and Robert Cook. Robert Cook was the butler who was in charge of the butts of wine. That's where the name comes from. And Richard Guise, obviously, William's own armor bearer, squire. And they came in with Agatha's key and they stabbed him multiple times in the chest. They didn't kill or hurt Lady Maude. Then they decided they had to get rid of the body. So they went down to the stables and got a sack for the body, drew water from the well, brought it into the kitchen, boiled the water in the kitchen, brought the water back up to the bedchamber, washed the body in the water so that to stop the wounds, so that when they put the body in the sack, the wounds wouldn't bleed and give them away. They then got out all of his riding clothes, his belt, his spurs, his boots, took all of that with them, saddled a couple of horses, put the body in the sack, put the sack on the horse, rode out. This is just two of them, apparently, and nobody else. Rode out and, yeah, and dumped the body in the night. They ride out about 4 miles and they dump out the body, dress the body in the field, and chuck it in the ditch, basically. And then they go home, and meanwhile, Maude is cleaning the bedchamber, presumably, and packing up the manor, and everybody leaves. And Maude and Richard and Agatha go, the three of them, to Ralph Paynell, who's about something like 40 miles away, something like that. And that's where they stayed until the sheriff turned up to arrest them. And the sheriff obviously said to Ralph, why did you take them in when you clearly knew that she'd killed her husband? And Ralph said, well, I didn't know that, and I didn't know he was dead, and apparently hadn't bothered to ask where William was for the past 3 months, and pleaded not guilty to aiding and abetting, and said that he had no idea.
So she double-crossed her co-conspirators, likely, right?
Well, yeah. Or I mean, there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot you could assume from that. There's a few different scenarios I think that fit that, and one of them is certainly that perhaps she wanted William dead, and she got Richard and Robert to do it for her, and then she threw them under the bus, and that's a very likely scenario. Some pertinent information, perhaps, is that after the trial was done, she married the sheriff. um, so, there's that. And in the 1930s, when this case was first looked at by Rosamund Sylum, who was a scholar who was interested in sort of Lincolnshire legal records of the Middle Ages, it was suggested that perhaps this was a love triangle, and Sylum's theory was that Maude was having an affair with the sheriff to begin with Thomas de Cydale, who was a fairly well-known man in Lincoln. And her husband came back and made things very difficult for her, and so she and Thomas and Sir Ralph were all in it together, and they coerced or bribed the servants to perform the deed, and then they made sure that two of them hanged for it. Meanwhile, all of the elite got off. So Ralph was found not guilty, and Maude was also found not guilty. So that's an interesting theory. I mean, it should be noted that in the 1930s, you did still have live-in servants. And so perhaps the idea of the servants being behind it and conspiring together to kill their master was perhaps not a very palatable or popular idea. And you also have a lot of the history being sort of top down, if you like, so focused on the elite and not considering the peasantry so much, or not considering sort of the lower classes so much. And so it made more sense from that sort of perspective to assume that only the elites were capable of some sort of conspiracy. Only the elites would have motive, or would be interested enough in removing William to go through this whole elaborate charade. And so that's been, because that was suggested back in 1938, I think, that has become the most popular interpretation of the evidence. Asylum had absolutely no evidence at all that any affair was happening between Maude and Thomas Kydale, or that they even knew each other before the trial at all. There's just nothing that I can see anyway to suggest that. The only reason she said that was because they got married afterwards. And there are, and you could spin that a number of ways if you wanted to. I mean, if you were particularly romantic, you could say, oh well, maybe they fell in love during the trial, and he did his whole sort of white knight routine, and or maybe Ralph Paynell, who was a much more important man than Sir Thomas Kydale was, pushed Maude at Kydale and went, well, she's now a widow and she needs protection. She wants, she needs to get married again. You're a widower. Why don't you get married? And that's what happened. He died. Thomas Kydale died in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, so he didn't last very long after that. But that was nothing to do with Maude. And she married again, and the third time she married Ralph Paynell's nephew. So it does seem that Ralph Paynell maintained, an interest, and her father had died some time ago. So it seems that Ralph Paynell had kind of stepped in to be that sort of father figure for her, and so sort of arranging her marriages after the fact, or at least was having some sort of behind the scenes influence there. But that's just kind of one idea. So you could think about it as if it was a servant conspiracy, and Maude didn't conspire with them to kill her husband, but they didn't kill her for reasons because perhaps she wasn't the one they had an issue with. But if somebody's got a knife and then says, now we have to leave, but you have to take me with you, she's not going to say no, is she? So you've got that kind of interpretation, which is also possible. Or you have the other idea, which, I mean, if you look at medieval responses to domestic violence, or things that the community deemed were too much, or, because domestic violence, unfortunately, in the Middle Ages was a fact of life, and also it was permitted up to a point. But if a community decided that somebody was being excessive, quote unquote, they would sort that out themselves. And it could get very, very violent. I mean, we're talking about a society which was considerably, the homicide rate was considerably higher than it was in the 1600s, say, which was about 5 times higher than it is today. So you're talking a very high rate of, and not just sort of premeditated murder, but also accidental death during fights, so manslaughter. It's a society where everybody is armed, and a lot of alcohol is being drunk generally, and you've
Yeah.
got people being trained to kill from a very young age, and people being very comfortable with death and being very used to death, and also generally a lot of trauma. So people react to things in different ways. So that's the context of that. You also have a very homosocial environment. So the household typically consists of teenagers or people in their 20s. Generally, it's predominantly men. or young men. In this particular case in the household, Agatha was the only other woman in the household apart from Lady Maude. Everybody else was, we don't know their ages, but the steward would have been an older man, the butler would have been slightly older, the pantler, who takes care of the pantry, would have been older, the cook would have been a bit older, but, sort of 30s, 40s. You could have people as young as 14 working in a household, and living in. So that's the dynamic that you've got. And 7 of them, including Agatha, knew each other before they came to work for Lady Maude at Scotton, because 7 of them were servants of a neighbour of theirs, of the Cantilupes. And if you're a career servant, you have a contract. And when their term of service ended, or he could no longer afford to keep on a household of that size, he had to let them go. And so they went from his service into the service of William Cantilupe. But very likely it was not William who hired them. It was probably Lady Maude who hired them, because William was away. And Lady Maude was the one who was in charge, if you like, while he was gone. You also have the fact that Scotton Manor was a Neville manor, not a Cantilupe manor, and so all the other servants are people that are known to Lady Maude. Her steward is her steward. He's a Neville man. He's not a Cantilupe man. He's served the Nevilles for a really long time. He's probably known Lady Maude for, since she was born. And William is staying there and is very much, it is very much not his manor. It is not his lands. These are not his people. These are his wife's people. And so if he were to mistreat his wife in front of those people, or if he was to mistreat or to assault or to attack Agatha, who is the only other woman in the household, that again is a possibility, because bearing in mind what the rumour of the county is about Nicholas, his brother, and the fact that he and Lady Maude do not have children. And it's quite possible that Lady Maude actually couldn't have children, because she didn't have children with either of her other 2 husbands after William. So if William felt like he had something to prove, one of the nearest people to him was his wife's maid. And if the other servants didn't like that, or they deemed his treatment of Maude, something they didn't like, they may well have taken it upon themselves to do something about that. But you can't do anything about it legally, because William, as a member of the local elite, is also a member of that sort of legal class as well. And is it likely that anyone is going to take the servants seriously when, how can you bring a charge against somebody who is basically in charge, you know? So it may be that they felt that they had very limited options. And it's very interesting, the number of stab wounds as well. He was unarmed at the time, so either it was an attack that it was meant to be an attack that was unexpected because he was ready for bed. So it was a time when they felt they could overpower him quite easily, because he'd been trained to kill people since he was very small. And you don't, you don't attack a knight who's been on campaign and has done things, without knowing that you could overpower him, without some sort of an assurance that it's not going to go tits up, basically. But I don't know if you can use that. That it's not going to go horribly wrong for you.
Right.
So it's again that kind of attacking him at night, and the diverse multiple stab wounds to the torso, either perhaps indicative of somebody who really, really wants to make sure that he's dead, or a very big kind of scuffle where he gets stabbed multiple times, and he's being, it's their flesh wounds, and you've got this big kind of fight going on with Maude presumably in bed watching it, or it's somebody who's very, very angry, you know. So you can interpret that evidence multiple ways. we don't have a record of what the motive was meant to be. And that's a key part of what we would consider today to be, a key part of the evidence, but that's not recorded in the trial records because that wasn't considered important. Because what was important to be recorded was who did it, when did they do it, how did they do it, and what happened to them, i.e., were they hanged, were they, incarcerated, what? That was it. The how is kind of irrelevant unless it's directly related to one of those factors, I guess. And for whatever reason, that the why wasn't recorded in this trial. So yeah.
Right. Even if she hadn't known about the original plan, she had to have known once it happened. And
Yeah.
and it is revealing that she still didn't say anything.
Yeah, yeah. It's so again, you've got is she involved, or is it because of his treatment of her? Is it because she was the one that orchestrated the attack, or is it because it's to do with his treatment of Agatha, and she doesn't like that either? And she's trying to protect. So Agatha is an interesting one because she is also very shadowy as a figure. We know literally nothing about her apart from her name and the fact that she starts off as Agatha Frere. She's recorded as Agatha Frere in the records. And then for some reason, and it's not said why, or if she suddenly got married while incarcerated, we're not entirely sure. It changes to Agatha Lovell. So a totally different surname, and that could be a scribal error, or it could be that they just got her name wrong, or that she got married and changed it at some point, or she was betrothed to, we don't know. Anyway, Agatha, whatever her name was in Lincoln jail because obviously she was due to be tried for aiding and abetting for giving the key, and she escaped Lincoln jail along with a couple of other prisoners and was never heard from again. She was waived, which is the female equivalent of outlawed. So the technical term, if you're a woman, is waived. And she doesn't appear again in the records, so apparently they didn't catch her. And the bailiffs were tried to see if they had helped her escape or not, and it was found that she and a few other prisoners had escaped due to their negligence and not through their deliberate collusion. Whether that's an accurate finding or not is entirely up to you, I guess. But yeah, she was not able to be brought to trial because she just vanished. So if it was about Agatha, and if it was, Maude was trying to protect her because she did take her with her. Maude did take Agatha with her to, Ralph Paynell's house. Then perhaps that escape was, in fact, something that was orchestrated on her behalf. But, yeah, it's another thing that we will never know.
Right, yeah. And as she faced trial, she had a lot of things going her way. The sheriff, for instance, put up the period equivalent of bail money for her, didn't he?
Yes, so that's not unusual either, though. It, and a number of them did, and she got some of her kinsmen to help her out as well, and a number of some of the local elite stumped up bail for her, and also for her steward, Robert of Cleetham. And yes, what happens is when the sheriff arrests someone in his locale, he is then generally held responsible for them and often will take them into his house and kind of keep them under house arrest or sort of vouch for them until they come back to court. Maude was taken into custody by Richard Willoughby for most of the trial, who's the marshal. And then when she's bailed out, they can't just sort of let her go. So presumably Thomas Kydale then had to vouch for her and bring her back to court because there were a number of court dates. And she was tried a couple of times. The first time for murder, the jury couldn't find her guilty of murder because there was no evidence, and she she said, no, it wasn't me, it was, these two lads, both of whom said that they were not guilty. So they indicted her again for aiding and abetting. And again, they couldn't find anyone to testify against her, and they couldn't come to a conclusion. So the actual verdict is not guilty because there is no evidence. So if this was a Scottish court, it would be not proven, not guilty. But because it's an English court, it's not guilty. They tried to get her back a third time on a similar charge, and the third time the jury found that they couldn't try her a third time because a verdict of not guilty, even if it was not guilty by lack of evidence, had already been recorded, and so the case was thrown out of court. So they tried really hard to get her for something, and if they'd actually got her on any of those charges, she would have been burned.
Wow.
This is very, very serious, because this isn't just murder. It's murder if a man kills a woman, or a husband kills, well, not if a husband kills his wife, that's murder. If a wife kills her husband or a servant kills their lord, that is petty treason. And that is the sort of domestic basis for high treason, for the count of high treason, which is against your king or your country, but in medieval period was against your king specifically. And that wasn't, it wasn't the other way round. It wasn't like, oh, it's petty treason because this is like, attacking your king. The household unit is the important one, and so treason is a thing because it is like if a wife were to kill her husband, or a servant was to kill his master. That's what it's like when you attack your king. So do you see which way round it is? So this is sort of the medieval mentality. So petty treason was a thing, but it was it's a statute of Edward III that crystallized this, and it's the first case of its kind to be tried under that statute, which makes it quite an interesting case. But there are several other cases, much earlier as well, where the same penalties apply, and wives were found guilty of killing their husbands. Juliana Murdoch was one who killed her husband Thomas Murdoch because she was in fact having an affair. And the person that the lord that she was having an affair with was imprisoned for a while in the Tower of London, and he got off for some reason because he didn't actually do the killing, presumably, although he was accused of sort of egging her on to do it, while she was burnt, and I think that was in 1316, so much earlier. And there are a few other examples as well. If you're a man and you're found guilty of petty treason, you're hanged, but you're drawn to the place of execution on a cart, and it's a public hanging for you. So that's what happened to Richard Guise and Robert Cook, who were both found guilty. So they were drawn and hanged, and there's the little note in the margin of their indictment where the scribe has just written in the margin the outcome, which is drawn and hanged. Uh, yeah.
Did they ever point the finger at Maude, or were they silent about her participation?
Nope. Both of them said that they were not guilty, and they threw themselves on the mercy of king and country, basically. And that's all they said.
Hmm.
So, somebody had to go down for it. That's the other thing. Like, it's impossible for a household of, that many people, about 16 people living in the same it's not a big manor. It's not. It's a modest sized manor. It's only got a few rooms. It's small enough that you've got a pantry, you've got a buttery, you've got a kitchen, you have a courtyard, you have some stables, you have a hall where you can entertain, you have a room for guests, a chamber for guests, and then you have the chamber for the lord and lady, and that's it. It's not a big place. and it's adjacent to the church. There is still a manor in Scotland, which is called the Old Manor, and confusingly, that is not the medieval one that we're talking about. The medieval one that we're talking about doesn't exist anymore, but there was an archaeological sort of survey done that found where it was, and it's very near. It's basically built a stone's throw away from the parish church, so it's very near the village, and so it's very difficult for anything to happen without everybody knowing about it, and yet only two people were accused, and the jury didn't buy that either. So the jury tried really hard to get a number of the other servants tried for murder. One of them was Augustin de Morpath. We know absolutely nothing about him either. And we don't know why. We don't know why they particularly wanted him, or why, they also wanted John Barnaby of Beckingham, who was the Chamberlain, who was the only other person to have the key. And they tried to get him as well, and they still couldn't. First of all, they didn't know where he was, because they didn't. None of these servants showed up to their court dates. But also, the jury have this list of about 6 or 7 people that they think are responsible for this murder. And yet the only people they've got, and the only people they can get hold of, are Richard Guise and Robert Cook. And those are the only people that Maude says, no, 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 none of the others, only these two. And it can't possibly have been just those two, because you can't possibly do all of that without waking everybody else up and everybody being complicit in it, you know? And also cleaning up and all of that. Like, it's not possible for just two guys to have done that on their own, and like everybody just slept through it or whatever and had nothing to do with it. That's not likely. So the jury tried their best to get as many people done for this murder as possible. And I mean, even though it was obvious, it must have been obvious to them at some point that they were not getting out of this alive. They just stuck to their guns and went, no, not guilty. And absolutely everybody who was indicted, including the steward, just said, nope, I'm not guilty. I'm in no way guilty. Do what you want, and didn't say anything. And so that just sounds like it. I don't know. Like, you could read it as they're just very committed to being bribed by their superiors, I guess. If it was a conspiracy that was orchestrated only by Lady Maude and the sheriff and Sir Ralph Paynell, if you're saying, oh, it depends who you're afraid of, I suppose. That could work. If you're keeping them quiet through fear, but then if you're going to die anyway, you know, depends. Are you going to tell anyone? Are you going to not?
Yeah.
Yeah, but or try and run away if you get released, or something. But or it was a conspiracy that the servants themselves were, they had a very good reason to protect each other, and that seems to be maybe what they were doing. It's the question of who might they have been protecting by their silence. Do they have each other's backs? Do they have a particular person's back? Did Richard and Robert just draw short straws? It's like, well, someone's got to be, someone's going down for this. Which of us is it going to be? And maybe if you say not guilty, maybe you'll get released. Maybe you'll get away with it. So it's it's a very interesting one. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Mm.
So, like you already stated, this is a time and place where murder ran rampant. Why is this particular crime so important, so studied by historians?
Well, I mean, it's not very, it isn't very studied. It's mainly important, I think, from a slightly drier perspective of legal historians, because, as I said, it's one of the first cases where the statute of petty treason was used, and so it's one of the first cases to be tried under that statute. So it's a very good kind of example of how medieval justice sort of operated with that statute in mind. But also, it's just a very interesting It's a very interesting case. I think it's because of the melodrama around it. And that was picked up in the 1930s when Salem first brought it to attention. So the review, H.M. Camm's review of Salem's volume on the Lincolnshire legal cases that she'd transcribed and compiled, and she wrote a lengthy introduction, focused on this case as part of his review, and said it was, just this fascinating, melodramatic kind of event that was very worthy of further study. And bearing in mind as well that the 1930s was the golden age of detective fiction. And Camm's review uses that language and deliberately makes these comparisons and says, well, the modern detective couldn't fail to spot, all of these sorts of clues, and says, well, a modern jury wouldn't have acquitted Lady Maude, and so really sells and buys into this kind of domestic disharmony and the Scarlet Woman sort of thing, and the corrupt sheriff and all of that sort of those glamorous stereotypes, right? And I
Right.
think that's
Yeah.
just a very appealing narrative, because it does play into all of those things, and it taps into those, that image of the sort of the Lady Macbeth figure, and the Sheriff of Nottingham figure, and
Yeah.
it's all very romantic, and it's all very, Ivanhoe and all that sort of thing. And I think historians and scholars can be guilty of romantic imaginations as much as anyone else.
Right.
But
Yeah.
yeah, and but it's just the way that going forwards, that sort of, if you like, traditional narrative, that traditional interpretation of events, has never really been challenged, and it's just been accepted as, and I think largely because people assume that Salem had more evidence for that theory than she actually had. And she was very much presenting it as a theory, but it, I think, was picked up as, oh, well, that's what must have happened. And so it's been uncritically cited. There's even a short biography of Maude's third husband, John Bussey, who was one of Richard II's favourites, and he outlived Lady Maude and was executed then when Bolingbroke came to power. But in that biography of him, of Bussey, you have the biographer talking about the notorious Lady Maude, who murdered her first husband with the help of her young lover. And I assume that that means Richard Guise, which is interesting because, of course, that's not what Salem said, but maybe that's what the biographer assumed. But that's another really interesting idea because, again, you're assuming a lot of things about all of these people, and none of which you can prove.
Well, this has been great. Thank you for taking some time with me. I do want to point out that you have a blog called Going Medieval, and you are on Twitter as well.
Yes, so I'm on Twitter at medievalmjj. I don't tweet very often on that account though, so um, but I do. I Yeah, you can kind of find me at my Going Medieval blog. I also publish fiction under C.M. Rosen's, and I have worked with Romancing the Gothic project, doing a short 2-session course on this case. And that's where I open it up to people who are interested in creative writing and that sort of, or historical fiction and that sort of thing. And we look at the case together and then try to have come up with a creative. People are encouraged to come up with a creative response to it, which is a lot of fun. So that course ran last year, just sort of a 2-session course. And if you go to romancingthegothic.wordpress.com, which is run by Dr. Sam Hurst, who's a colleague of mine who's now in Liverpool University, you can maybe sign up for future courses if that's of interest. I also run an 8-week version of the course with a more sort of scholarly academic kind of bent to it, where we look at the 14th century society as a whole through the lens of the murder. So using the murder and using the case as a way of opening up discussions around 14th century English society at all levels. So that's at Cardiff University, and that's usually run in the spring term. So through the Centre of Continuing and Professional Education. So that's something that anyone can sort of sign up for. And it's a course that's open to people who are not members of the university.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much for your time today.
No, you're very welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
Again, my guest has been Melissa Julian-Jones. Her book is called Murder During the 100 Years' War, The Curious Case of Sir William Cantilupe. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenes, and have a safe tomorrow.